Did you know that over 16 million Americans served in World War II? That's more than the entire population of New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles combined today. They were mostly young, barely out of their teens. They came from farms and cities, from poverty and comfort. They were asked to save the world, and in many ways they did. But what does that really mean? We see the black and white photos. We use the label Tom Brokaw gave them the greatest generation. It's a heavy title. Does it fit? Was it earned through simple victory or through something deeper, something harder to see? Like, what did it cost them to wear that crown? Like, these are not just pictures of a war. They are pictures of a people who faced a global crisis and found something in themselves they never knew they had. Let's look past the myths. Let's look at the faces, the hands, the quiet moments between the battles. What do they show us about who we are? Number 25, what did a promise look like? Picture a young woman on a train platform. She's not in uniform, she's wearing a simple dress, she's handing a sandwich wrapped in wax paper to a young man leaning out of a train window. He is in uniform, his face is a mix of excitement and fear, her face is a study in quiet resolve. This isn't a famous photograph. It's a moment that happened a million times over. It's a picture of a promise. The promise was simple. You go, and we'll be here. It was a promise made by wives and girlfriends, mothers and sisters. It was a promise to keep life going. Keep the homes, the towns, the idea of America intact while the men were away. This wasn't a passive role. It was an active, exhausting, and vital part of the war effort. The emotional labor of that generation of women was a strategic resource, as critical as steel or oil. They wrote letters, millions and millions of letters. V-mail, or victory mail, was a specific system established in June 1942. A letter was written on a special form, photographed, reduced to the size of a thumbnail on a roll of microfilm, and then printed back out at its destination. A single mail bag could carry what would have required 37 bags of regular mail, saving precious cargo space on ships and planes. In her book, American Women and World War II, historian Doris Weatherford explains that these letters were the lifeline. They carried news of a new baby, the harvest, a high school basketball game. They were tangible proof that the world they were fighting for still existed. But it was more than letters. It was a promise to wait, and waiting is a hard, uncertain job. Women put their own lives on hold. Their marriages were postponed, dreams were deferred, they faced the constant, gnawing anxiety of a telegram arriving at the door. Every knot could be the one. Sociologist Glenn H. Elder Jr.'s groundbreaking work, Children of the Great Depression, tracked the lives of individuals through these decades. He found that the war profoundly reshaped family structures and personal timelines, with women often bearing the psychological burden of uncertainty for years on end. They were the keepers of memory and the anchors of the future. The man on the train wasn't just fighting for an abstract idea of freedom. He was fighting for her, for the life they were supposed to have. He was fighting for the quiet, normal world represented by a simple sandwich on a train platform. The promise was that this world would be waiting for his return. For millions it was, for hundreds of thousands it wasn't. What happens to a society when millions of its promises are broken by death? How many women who made that promise on the platform never got to fulfill it? And what do we owe the people who are still waiting? Number 24, how do you build a bridge out of mud? Imagine a line of men, caked in mud from head to toe. They aren't holding rifles, they are holding shovels, wrenches, and heavy timbers. In front of them is a bombed-out bridge over a churning brown river. Behind them, a line of trucks and tanks stretches to the horizon. They are the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Navy Seabees. Their job wasn't to take the hill, but to build the road to it. The war was a war of logistics. It was won as much by engineers as by infantry. The famous general, William Tecumseh Sherman, said that an army marches on its stomach. In the 1940s, it marched on roads, bridges, and airstrips. The men who built these things were often working under fire, in impossible conditions. The motto of the Seabees was "Can Do." It was more than a slogan, it was a job description. Formed in March 1942, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Seabees were recruited from civilian construction trades. They were older, more experienced men who knew how to build things. They were told, "We build, we fight." Think of the Alcon Highway. The Alaska-Canada Highway was a monumental feat of engineering. In 1942, the threat to Alaska was real. A land route was needed to supply military bases. In just over 8 months, more than 10,000 soldiers and 6,000 civilian workers pushed a 1,700-mile road through solid rock, frozen ground, and dense forest. It was an impossible task, done at incredible speed. Historian Ken Coates, in his book The Alaska Highway in World War II, describes the brutal conditions, temperatures dropping to 70 below zero, swarms of insects, endless mud. It was a war against nature itself, and it wasn't just roads. In the Pacific Islands, the Seabees would land with the first waves of Marines. While the fighting was still happening, they would be bulldozing jungles to create airstrips. A functional runway could appear in a matter of days. These were the forward operating bases from which the air war was launched. They didn't just build, they repaired. When a port was captured, it was often a wreck of sunken ships and destroyed cranes. The engineers and Seabees went to work, clearing harbors, patching docks, and getting the supplies flowing again. They were the circulatory system of the entire Allied war machine. The picture of these muddy men is a picture of unseen, unglamorous, essential work. They didn't get the headlines, they were the foundation. General Douglas MacArthur recognized their importance, stating that the war in the Pacific was a war in the headlines. Every bomber that took off, every tank that crossed a river, every wounded soldier evacuated to a hospital did so because of the work of these men. They built the modern world's infrastructure at gunpoint. How much of the post-war economic boom was built on the skills and sheer audacity learned by these engineers in the mud of Europe and the jungles of the Pacific? Did their ability to see a solution in a landscape of problems change the American mindset forever? And what happens to a country when it forgets how to build things? Number 23, who was allowed to be a hero? I'll picture a group of young pilots. They are standing by their planes, P-51 Mustangs, with a distinctive red tail. They are confident, skilled, and they are all black. They are the Tuskegee Airmen. This picture is one of pride and defiance. It's a challenge to the very idea of who was considered worthy to fight for their country. The American military that fought the Second World War was segregated. It was a reflection of the country itself. The prevailing racist view held by many in the military high command was that African Americans were not intelligent or brave enough for combat roles, especially not for something as complex as flying a modern fighter plane. The Tuskegee experiment was set up, in part, to fail. It was an Army Air Corps program to train black pilots at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, but it didn't fail. The 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group, known as the Tuskegee Airmen, became one of the most respected units in the air war over Europe. They flew more than 15,000 individual sorties. Their primary role was bomber escort, protecting the heavy B-17 and B-24 bombers on their dangerous missions deep into enemy territory. The bombers they escorted came to call them the Red-Tailed Angels because of their distinctive markings and their reputation for staying with the big friends no matter what. The legend grew that they never lost a bomber to enemy fighters. While post-war analysis by researchers like Daniel Hallman has shown this to be a myth, a few bombers were indeed lost time. The number was extraordinarily low, far lower than the average for other escort groups. Their record was exceptional. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen is a story of fighting two wars at once. One against the Axis powers in the sky and another against racism on the ground. When not flying, these officers and enlisted men faced discrimination and segregation, even on military bases. They were commanded by white officers in a system that saw them as inferior, yet they performed with incredible discipline and courage. To men like Benjamin O. Davis Jr., a West Point graduate who was shunned by his white classmates for 4 years, rose to become the commander of the 332nd and later the first African-American general in the Air Force. This picture isn't just about pilots. It's about all the minority groups who served with distinction in a segregated military. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers, became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. Many of these men had families who were being held in internment camps back in the United States. They fought to prove their loyalty to a country that had imprisoned their parents. The Navajo Code Talkers created an unbreakable code using their native language, a vital tool in the Pacific theater. Their contribution, detailed in works like Chester Nez's memoir Code Talker, was classified for decades. These stories force us to ask a difficult question. The war was fought for freedom and democracy, but for whom? The service of these men exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of the American project. Their heroism wasn't just in combat. Their heroism was in serving a country that didn't fully see them as citizens. If a nation can demand the ultimate sacrifice from people it simultaneously oppresses, what does that say about the nature of patriotism? How many other stories of heroism from minority soldiers have been lost or ignored by history? And did their fight for a double victory abroad and at home truly change the country they returned to? Number 22, what does 1,000,000 tons of steel look like? Imagine a vast shipyard, not one ship, but dozens, in various stages of construction. They stretch as far as the eye can see. Sparks fly from welders. Giant cranes swing steel plates into place. And crawling all over these steel skeletons are thousands of workers, men and women, working around the clock. This is a picture of industrial might on a scale the world had never seen. The war was not just won on the battlefield. It was won in the factory. It was won by the ability of the United States to outproduce the enemy overwhelmingly. Before the U.S. entered the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called on the nation to become the arsenal of democracy. It was a bold claim. The country was still emerging from the Great Depression, but the industrial base, once mobilized, performed a miracle. Take the Liberty ships. These were cargo ships, the workhorses of the war. They were not pretty or fast, but they could be built quickly and in huge numbers. The industrialist Henry J. Kaiser applied mass production techniques to shipbuilding. Instead of building a ship from the keel up in one spot, sections were prefabricated all over the shipyard and then welded together. The process was revolutionary. The first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, took about 230 days to build. By the end of the war, Kaiser's shipyards had gotten the process down to an average of 42 days. In a famous publicity stunt in November 1942, the yard in Richmond, California built the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. More than 2,700 Liberty ships were built. They carried troops, tanks, food, and fuel across every ocean.
This industrial explosion happened across the board. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford Motor Company, was a 1-mile-long assembly line for B-24 Liberator bombers.
At its peak, it was producing one bomber every 63 minutes. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced about 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 12.5 million rifles. As historian Mark Harrison notes in his work on the economics of World War II, by 1944, the U.S. was producing about 40% of all the armaments in the world. This was the brute force of production that the Axis powers simply could not match. This picture of the shipyard is also a picture of a transformed workforce. Millions of people moved from rural areas to industrial centers. The Rosie the Riveter icon represents the more than 6 million women who entered the manufacturing workforce, doing jobs previously considered men's work. They were welders, mechanics, and riveters. This experience, as detailed in Penny Coleman's book, Rosie the Riveter Women Working on the Home Front in World War II, permanently changed the role of women in the American economy and society. The sheer scale of it is hard to comprehend. It was a mobilization of people, resources, and ingenuity. It was a country that had been on its knees a decade earlier, now building an entire world's worth of war material. How did a nation of individualists and entrepreneurs so quickly embrace a level of centralized planning and collective effort that rivaled socialist states? What were the long-term environmental and social costs of this rapid, unregulated industrialization? And when the war was over, what happened to the expectation that American industry could solve any problem, no matter how large? Number 21, what was in a soldier's pockets? Picture the contents of a soldier's pockets laid out on a simple wool blanket. A small worn Bible or a Star of David. A Zippo lighter, maybe with a crude engraving. A few crumpled letters from home, the creases soft as cloth. A photo of a girl, a wife, or a baby. A dog tag. Maybe a lucky coin. This isn't a picture of war. It's a picture of the things a man carries to remind him he's human. In the face of the massive impersonal machinery of war, soldiers held on to small personal talismans. These were the objects that connected them to a life beyond the mud and the fear. They were reminders of who they were and what they were fighting for. The war was fought on a global scale, with armies of millions, but for the individual soldier, it was an intensely personal experience. His world shrank to his squad, his foxhole, and the contents of his pockets. The writer Tim O'Brien, in his book about the Vietnam War, The Things They Carried, masterfully explores this idea. But the soldiers of the Second World War did the same. They carried the physical weight of their gear, the M1 rifle, the ammunition, the helmet, the pack. But they also carried the emotional weight of these small objects. A photo wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a reason to survive. A letter wasn't just ink, it was a voice from another world, a world of safety and love. The military understood this need for connection. The V-mail system was a logistical tool, but it was also a morale machine. The distribution of cigarettes and chocolate bars by the Red Cross or the USO was about more than just a small luxury. It was a reminder of home, a taste of normalcy. The popular pinups of actresses like Betty Grable, often taped to the inside of a locker or the fuselage of a plane, were more than just cheesecake. They were an idealized symbol of the America the soldiers had left behind. They represented a world of glamour, fun, and femininity in a universe that had become exclusively masculine and brutal. Even the gear itself could become personal. The M1 Garand rifle, which General George S. Patton called the greatest battle implement ever devised, was issued to millions. But each rifle had its own feel, its own history. Soldiers cleaned them, cared for them, and trusted their lives to them. The distinctive ping sound the M1 made when its 8-round clip was ejected became one of the iconic sounds of the war. A sound that could mean both safety, the enemy is out of ammo, and danger, I am out of ammo. This intimate collection of objects tells a story that grand histories often miss. It shows us the soldier not as a statistic or a piece of a larger strategy, but as an individual. A son, a husband, a father who was trying to hold on to his identity in a world that was trying to strip it away. These items were anchors in a storm of chaos. How many of these personal artifacts now sit in dusty boxes, in attics, their stories lost forever? If you could listen to the stories these objects could tell, what would you learn about courage, fear, and love? And in our digital age, where photos and letters exist on a screen, what are the tangible things we carry to remind us of who we are? But number 20, where did the food come from? And picture a family in their backyard, but instead of a neat lawn, they are surrounded by rows of vegetables. A father turns the soil with a spade. A mother and her children are planting seeds. A sign hammered into the ground reads, "Victory Garden." This is a picture of the war effort on the most personal scale imaginable, the family dinner table. The war put an immense strain on the global food supply. Millions of farmers were now soldiers. Transportation was dedicated to moving troops and weapons, not produce. And America had to feed not only its own army and population, but also help feed its allies, like Great Britain, through the Lend-Lease program. The solution was a massive, decentralized, citizen-led agricultural movement. The government encouraged people to plant victory gardens. The idea was simple. If citizens could grow their own fruits and vegetables, it would free up the commercial food supply for the troops and for export. The campaign was a huge success. Posters with slogans like "Sow the seeds of victory" and "Our food is fighting" were everywhere. Public parks, backyards, and even window boxes were turned into miniature farms. By 1944, an estimated 20 million victory gardens were in operation. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture at the time, these gardens produced about 8 million tons of food, which was more than 40% of all the fresh fruits and vegetables consumed in the United States. This effort was paired with a strict system of rationing. Starting in 1942, the government began to ration essential goods. Sugar, coffee, meat, cheese, canned goods, and gasoline were all limited. Every person was issued a ration book filled with stamps. To buy a pound of sugar, you needed the money in the right stamp. This system was designed to ensure a fair distribution of scarce resources and to prevent hoarding and price gouging. As documented in sources like the National Archives, the Office of Price Administration managed this complex system which touched the life of every single American. Rationing and victory gardening changed the way Americans ate and lived. It fostered a culture of conservation and ingenuity. Housewives became experts at stretching a pound of ground beef into multiple meals. They rediscovered old techniques of canning and preserving. And communities organized canning kitchens to process the bounty from their victory gardens. It was a shared sacrifice. Everyone was in it together. The feeling was that by giving up a little sugar in your coffee, you were helping a soldier on the front line. This picture of a family in their garden is a picture of patriotism expressed through practical, everyday action. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small daily choices that when multiplied by millions, had a massive strategic impact. It connected the home front directly to the battlefront. Every carrot pulled from the ground was a small blow against the enemy. How did this period of forced conservation and community effort shape the generation's attitude towards consumption and waste in the post-war era of abundance? Did the experience of rationing create a sense of social solidarity that we have since lost? And could our society today mobilize for a similar collective effort in the face of a global crisis? Number 19, how do you tell a story with a cartoon? Imagine a drawing. It's not a photograph. It's a simple ink drawing of two soldiers. They are slouched in a muddy foxhole, their uniforms tattered, their faces covered in stubble. One says to the other, "My God, here they come again." They are exhausted, cynical, and utterly without glamour. These are Willie and Joe, and this picture is a window into the soul of the common soldier. The artist was Bill Mauldin, a young sergeant who drew for the military newspaper Stars and Stripes. His cartoons were wildly popular with the troops because they were real. Mauldin didn't draw heroes in clean uniforms winning medals. He drew GIs dealing with the misery of war, the rain, the mud, the bad food, the incompetent officers, the sheer, grinding exhaustion of it all. He captured the dark humor and the profound weariness of the frontline soldier. His work was the voice of the enlisted man. Mauldin's cartoons were so popular and so honest that they sometimes got him into trouble. The famous General George S. Patton hated them. Patton was a spit and polished general who believed in discipline and the heroic image of the soldier. He felt Mauldin's scruffy characters were disrespectful and bad for morale. At one point, he threatened to have Stars and Stripes banned from his Third Army. In his memoir, Up Front, Mauldin recounts being summoned to a meeting with Patton. The general berated him, but Mauldin stood his ground, defending his work. The Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped in. He recognized that Mauldin's cartoons were actually a vital outlet for the soldiers, a way for them to vent their frustrations. He told Patton to leave Mauldin alone. This was a unique form of wartime journalism. Mauldin was there. He was one of them. He experienced the things he drew. His work provides a historical record that is more emotionally true than many official reports. It shows that the greatest generation wasn't a monolith of cheerful, can-do patriots. They were often miserable, scared, and deeply cynical about the bureaucracy of the army. But they did their job. They endured. Willie and Joe were archetypes. They represented every soldier who ever had to sleep in a wet foxhole or eat a cold K ration. They were survivors. Mauldin won a Pulitzer Prize for his work in 1945. His cartoons humanized the war. They showed that behind the grand strategies and the pins on the map were millions of individual human beings just trying to get through one more day. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of humor to make the unbearable bearable. Why is it that a simple cartoon could sometimes capture the truth of a soldier's experience better than a 1,000-word report? What does the conflict between Mauldin and Patton tell us about the different realities of leadership and the front line? And have we lost the ability to use humor to speak truth to power in the same way? Number 18, what did the sky sound like? Picture a clear blue sky suddenly filled with hundreds of B-17 bombers. They fly in a tight geometric formation, a combat box designed for mutual defense. The sun glints off their silver wings. It's a beautiful, terrifying sight. This is a picture of a new kind of warfare, one fought miles above the earth, with a level of technological complexity and human bravery that was unprecedented. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe was one of the central pillars of the Allied strategy. The theory, first articulated by thinkers like Julio Duhet, was that you could defeat a nation by destroying its ability to make war its factories, its oil refineries, its transportation networks. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, was tasked with carrying out this mission through high-altitude daylight precision bombing. It was incredibly dangerous work. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a tough plane, armed with 13.50 caliber machine guns, but it was flying deep into enemy territory. It faced anti-aircraft fire from the ground, known as flak, and attacks from swarms of enemy fighter planes. A tour of duty for a bomber crew was initially set at 25 missions. The odds of completing a tour were so low that many crews didn't expect to survive. The overall loss rate for the 8th Air Force was staggering. According to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, the 8th suffered more than 47,000 casualties, including more than 26,000 killed, the highest of any American numbered Air Force. The experience inside a B-17 at 25,000 feet was brutal. The temperature could be 50 degrees below zero. The crew wore electrically heated suits that often malfunctioned. They had to be on oxygen masks to survive. And they were in a constant state of high alert for hours on end, scanning the sky for tiny black specks that would quickly grow into enemy fighters. The book and film 12 O'Clock High vividly portray the immense psychological pressure on these men and their commanders. The concept of maximum effort missions meant pushing men and machines to their absolute limit day after day. The picture of that bomber formation is a picture of organized courage. Each man pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, gunner's uniforms had a specific, highly skilled job to do. They depended on each other completely. The ONCAP box formation was designed so that the machine guns of the different planes could provide overlapping fields of fire, creating a protective screen of lead. It was a strategy based on teamwork and mutual trust, executed under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The effectiveness of this strategic bombing campaign is still debated by historians. It did not, by itself, cause the collapse of the German war economy, as some had hoped. But as Richard Overy argues in his book, The Bombers and the Bombed, it did severely cripple production, divert huge resources to air defense, and ultimately helped pave the way for the ground invasion of Europe. For the men in the planes, it was simply a job they had to do, a terrifying and often fatal commute to the office. What was the true psychological toll on the young men who had to face death on a statistical, daily basis? How did the experience of unleashing such massive destruction from a distance change our concept of warfare and morality? And what do we still not understand about the long-term health effects on air crews who flew in unpressurized cabins at extreme altitudes? Number 17, how do you pack an invasion? Imagine a beach, not a sandy resort, but a stretch of English coastline covered with men and machines. Tanks are being waterproofed. Mountains of ammunition boxes are stacked high. Soldiers are practicing climbing down rope nets into landing craft. This is a picture of organized chaos. It is the build-up to the largest amphibious invasion in human history, D-Day. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944 are often remembered for the brutal fighting on the beaches, but the success of that day was made possible by months, even years, of meticulous, mind-bogglingly complex planning. It was a logistical masterpiece. The man in charge of the whole operation was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was a master of organization and diplomacy, able to get the fiercely independent leaders of the Army, Navy, and Air Force from different allied nations to work together. Consider the numbers involved in Operation Overlord. The invasion force included nearly 7,000 ships and landing craft. Over 11,000 aircraft were in the air. On that first day, more than 156,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy. And this was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, millions more men and tons of supplies would pour onto the continent. As Stephen E. Ambrose details in his book, D-Day, every single detail had to be planned. Weather patterns had to be predicted. The tides had to be calculated. The exact location and strength of enemy defenses had to be mapped out. The planners had to think of everything. They built two massive artificial harbors called mulberries, which were towed across the English Channel and assembled off the coast of Normandy. This allowed the Allies to unload supplies directly onto the shore without having to capture a major port first. They laid an underwater oil pipeline, Pluto pipeline under the ocean to pump fuel directly to the advancing armies. They executed a massive deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, to trick the German high command into believing the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. This involved fake armies, inflatable tanks, and false radio traffic. The picture of that English beach is a picture of a nation's entire resources being focused on a single point. It involved scientists, engineers, factory workers, meteorologists, and spies. The soldier in the landing craft was the final, sharpest point of a very long spear that had been forged over years by millions of people. He had the trust that the planners had done their job, that the intelligence was right, that the ships would be in the right place, that the air support would be there. The scale of it is almost impossible to grasp. It was the most complex undertaking in the history of human organization up to that point. It was a gamble on a colossal scale. Eisenhower famously drafted a note to be released in case the invasion failed, taking full responsibility upon himself. The pressure on the men who planned this operation was immense. The fate of the world rested on their calculations. How do you even begin to coordinate the movements of millions of people and millions of tons of equipment? What kind of leadership does it take to get so many competing interests to work towards a single goal? And What are the forgotten logistical innovations from that period that still shape our modern world? Number 16, what did a Red Cross donut taste like? Picture a young woman in a simple uniform, a red cross on her sleeve. She is standing behind a makeshift counter in a dreary, rain-soaked camp somewhere in England or France. She is smiling as she hands a fresh donut and a hot cup of coffee to a soldier who looks like he hasn't slept in a week. This is a picture of a small comfort in a world of hardship. The American Red Cross played a vital and sometimes overlooked role in the war. They were not a military organization, they were civilians, many of them women, who volunteered to serve near the front lines. Their mission was to provide for the welfare and morale of the troops. They ran clubs called Clumobiles, which were converted buses equipped with kitchens and lounges. These mobile canteens would travel to remote airfields and camps, bringing a touch of home to the soldiers. The donut dollies, as they were affectionately known, became a symbol of this effort. The simple act of providing a fresh American-style donut and coffee was a powerful reminder of the world the soldiers were fighting for. It was a taste of normalcy in an abnormal situation, in a place where everything was GI issue and military green. A friendly face and a sweet treat could make a huge difference in a soldier's day. The Red Cross produced millions of donuts over the course of the war, but their work went far beyond donuts. The Red Cross was responsible for collecting and processing blood plasma, a critical life-saving resource on the battlefield. Dr. Charles Drew, an African-American surgeon, developed the techniques for processing and storing blood plasma that made the National Blood Bank program possible. Tragically, the military insisted on segregating the blood donated by black and white citizens, a policy Dr. Drew vehemently protested. The Red Cross also transmitted messages between soldiers and their families back home, especially in emergencies. They helped prisoners of war by distributing aid packages with food, clothing, and medicine. The women who served in the Red Cross were often close to the danger. They worked in field hospitals, helping nurses and comforting wounded men. They served in rest areas just behind the front lines. They endured the same rough conditions, the same bad weather, and sometimes the same dangers as the soldiers they served. Their work was emotionally taxing. They were a listening ear for young men who were scared, lonely, and homesick. This picture of a Red Cross volunteer is a picture of compassion in action. It demonstrates that the war effort wasn't just about fighting. It was also about caring. It was about recognizing the humanity of the soldier and providing for his needs beyond the purely military. It was a massive organized effort to maintain the morale and spirit of an army of millions, one cup of coffee at a time. How did the experience of serving overseas as civilians change the lives and perspectives of these thousands of American women? What is the real measurable impact of morale on the effectiveness of a fighting force? And what does the story of the segregated blood program tell us about the persistent contradictions of the American war effort? Number 15, what does silence sound like? Picture a young man, he's not charging a hill, he's not firing a rifle, he's sitting on an ammo crate, his helmet on the ground beside him, just staring into the middle distance. His uniform is dirty, his face is blank. This is a picture of the other 99% of war, the waiting. We imagine war as constant action, a Hollywood montage of explosions and heroism. The reality for most soldiers was long periods of crushing boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. They waited for orders, they waited for mail from home, they waited for the supply trucks to bring food, they waited for the rain to stop, they waited for the enemy to attack, and they waited for it all to be over. This waiting was not restful, it was a tense, anxious state. The silence could be more terrifying than the noise, because you never knew when it would be broken. In his classic oral history, The Good War, Studs Terkel collected the stories of hundreds of veterans. A recurring theme in their accounts is the memory of this waiting, the hurry up and wait. That is the unofficial motto of every army. Soldiers learned to make a home in a foxhole. They cleaned their weapons obsessively, they played cards, they told stories, they tried not to think too much about what might happen next. This experience was captured perfectly by the cartoonist Bill Malden, whose Willie and Joe characters were almost always waiting for something. They were masters of survival, not in the heroic sense, but in the practical sense of finding a dry place to sleep or a way to heat a can of C rations. This was the unglamorous reality of life at the front. The military was a massive logistical organism, and for every soldier on the front line, there were many more in support roles. There were mechanics, clerks, cooks, drivers, and warehouse workers. Their war was also one of routine and waiting. They were far from the immediate danger of combat, but they were also far from home, living a regimented life in a foreign land. This psychological state of prolonged stress and boredom had a name. They called it combat fatigue or shell shock. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). The military was only beginning to understand the deep psychological wounds that this kind of experience could inflict. Men would simply break down. The constant tension, the lack of sleep, the memory of what they had seen, it could become too much. Doctors and psychiatrists like William C. Menninger worked to develop treatments, recognizing that these were not cases of cowardice, but legitimate medical injuries of the mind. The picture of the waiting soldier is a picture of the internal war. The battle against fear, against despair, against the loss of hope. It was a fight that every soldier fought alone in the quiet moments between the chaos. For many, it was a fight that continued long after they came home. How many brilliant ideas, poems, or solutions were lost in that endless, crushing boredom? If we could measure the psychological weight of that waiting, what would it tell us about the wars we fight today? And what do they do with the silence when the noise finally stopped for good? Number 14, who answered the phone? Picture a switchboard, a maze of wires and plugs. In front of it sits a woman in a crisp uniform. She is calm and focused, plugging and unplugging cables with speed and precision. She is a member of the Women's Army Corps, or WWII. This is a picture of the communications revolution that was essential to winning the war. While women were not allowed in combat roles, their contribution to the military was vital. The formation of Women's Auxiliary Corps in the various branches of the military was a major social and military change. The WWII Army, the Waves Navy, the Spars Coast Guard, and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve brought hundreds of thousands of women into the service. The slogan was that they would free a man to fight. And they did. They took on essential non-combat jobs, allowing more men to be sent to the front lines. The director of the WWII, Oveta Kulpabi, oversaw this massive new organization. Women served as clerks, typists, mechanics, drivers, and mail sorters. They worked in cryptography, decoding enemy messages, they rigged parachutes, and they were essential to the nervous system of the modern Army communications. They operated the telephone switchboards and the teletype machines that connected commanders in Washington to generals in the field. The work was demanding and required skill and discretion. A signals operator in London or at the Pentagon was handling highly classified information. A mistake could cost lives. The image of the switchboard operator is a powerful one because it represents the complexity of modern warfare. The war was commanded and controlled through these electronic networks. The generals made the decisions, but it was these women who physically connected them, who made sure the orders got through. Over 150,000 women served in the WWII. Some of them served overseas, close to the fighting in every theater of the war. They were not just in safe rear areas. WWIIs landed in North Africa, Italy, and in France just after the D-Day invasion. They endured the same conditions as the men, living in tents and working in bombed-out buildings. Over 600 WWIIs received medals for their service. This was a quiet revolution. The sight of women in uniform became a common one. It challenged traditional ideas about the role of women in society. These were not just girls helping out. They were soldiers, sailors, and Marines. They were part of the military structure, subject to military discipline. Their service, documented in works like Mattie E. Treadwell's Official History of the WWII, paved the way for the full integration of women into the armed forces in the decades that followed. How did the experience of military service, with its discipline and opportunities for advancement, change the ambitions and expectations of this generation of women? What were the untold stories of harassment and discrimination they faced within this male-dominated institution? And how did their vital role in military communications shape the development of our modern information-based society? Number 13. What does a flag on a mountaintop mean? Picture a small group of Marines straining to raise a flag on a pole atop a desolate, rocky mountain. The landscape around them is barren and scarred by battle. This is, of course, the iconic image from the Battle of Iwo Jima. It is perhaps the most famous photograph of the entire war, but what does it really show us? The photograph taken by Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press on February 23rd, 1945, is a picture of triumph. It symbolizes the hard-won victory in the Pacific. The battle for the tiny island of Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest in the history of the Marine Corps. The island was a volcanic rock, honeycombed with tunnels, bunkers, and caves by its Japanese defenders. The fighting was brutal, close quarters combat. The U.S. suffered over 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed, to take an island that was only 8 square miles. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi was a powerful moment. It was a signal to the men fighting all over the island and to the ships offshore that the highest point on the island had been taken. It was a huge morale booster, but the famous photograph actually depicts the second flag raising of that day. A smaller flag had been raised earlier, but a commander decided a larger one was needed to be more visible. Rosenthal captured the second raising, and the image became an instant sensation back home. It was used to sell war bonds. It was put on posters and stamps. It became a symbol of American heroism and sacrifice. It was so powerful that 3 of the surviving flag raisers in the photo were brought back to the States to participate in a war bond tour. The photograph gave the American people a tangible image of victory at a time when they were growing weary of the long, costly war. But the picture is also a complex and even tragic one. Of the 6 men in the photograph, 3 were killed in action on Iwo Jima in the days that followed. The survivors often felt uncomfortable with their celebrity. They were heroes, but they knew that the real heroes were the ones who didn't come back. The book Flags of Our Fathers, written by James Bradley, the son of one of the flag raisers, explores this difficult story. It delves into the lives of these men and the burden of being symbols. So the picture of the flag raising is 2 things at once. It is a genuine moment of collective effort and a symbol of national unity and purpose, but it is also a piece of propaganda, an image that was used by the government to shape public opinion. It hides as much as it reveals. It doesn't show the cost of that victory. It doesn't show the faces of the men who died taking that mountain. It freezes a single, triumphant moment in time, masking the brutal reality of the battle that surrounded it. What is the line between documenting history and creating a myth? How does a single image come to represent the experience of millions? And what happens to the real people who become trapped inside these powerful symbols? Number 12, how do you say goodbye to a ship? Picture a great warship, the USS Enterprise, sailing into New York Harbor. Its flight deck is packed with cheering servicemen returning home. But the ship itself is battered and scarred. It bears the marks of years of hard fighting. This is a picture of a weary survivor. The war in the Pacific was fundamentally a naval war. It was fought across vast expanses of ocean, a series of brutal carrier battles and island-hopping campaigns. The ships were the key. They were floating cities, complex machines that carried thousands of men, and a fleet of aircraft. And the sailors who manned them developed a deep connection to their vessels. A ship was more than just a piece of hardware. It was a home, a fortress, and a comrade. The USS Enterprise CV-6 was one of the most famous ships of the war. Nicknamed the Big E, it was one of only 3 American carriers from before the war to survive the entire conflict. It fought in more major actions of the war against Japan than any other U.S. ship. It was there for the Doolittle Raid, the Battle of Midway, the Guadalcanal Campaign, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and Okinawa. It was damaged multiple times by bombs and kamikaze attacks, but it was always patched up and sent back into the fight. The ship and its crew earned a reputation for being lucky and tough. The relationship between a sailor and his ship is a unique bond. These men lived and worked in close quarters under constant stress. They knew every inch of their vessel, every sound the engines made, every quirk in its handling. They fought fires together, they repaired battle damage together, they buried their shipmates at sea together. The ship became the center of their universe. The story of the Enterprise, as told in books like The Big E by Edward P. Stafford, is the story of the men who served on her. When the war ended, the Big E helped bring thousands of troops home as part of Operation Magic Carpet. But its fighting days were over. Despite efforts by the crew and the public to save it as a museum, the legendary carrier was sold for scrap in 1958. For the men who had served on her, it was like losing a family member. They held reunions for decades, telling stories of their time on the galloping ghosts of the Oahu coast. The picture of a returning warship is a picture of this deep human-machine bond. These weren't just abstract numbers in a naval registry. They were places where men had lived, fought, and died. They were repositories of memory and courage. The thousands of ships built for the war effort, from the mighty battleships to the humble landing craft, each had a story. Most of them met the same fate as the Enterprise, cut apart for scrap metal after the peace was won. How does a crew's collective spirit and identity get infused into a machine of steel? What are the psychological effects on a sailor when the ship they considered home is gone forever? And how many irreplaceable stories were lost when these great ships were dismantled? Number 11, what was a GI Bill? Picture a young man a few years older than a typical college student sitting in a university classroom. He's wearing civilian clothes, but his haircut and his serious expression hint at his recent past. He's a veteran, and he's here because of a single, transformative piece of legislation. This is a picture of a nation investing in its future. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, universally known as the GI Bill of Rights, was one of the most significant laws ever passed in the United States. As the war was nearing its end, policymakers worried about what would happen when 16 million service members returned to civilian life. They feared a return to the mass unemployment of the Great Depression. The GI Bill was the answer. It had three main provisions. It provided money for veterans to attend college or vocational school. It offered low interest, zero down payment home loans, and it provided unemployment benefits for up to a year. The impact was revolutionary. Before the war, a college education was largely the privilege of the wealthy. The GI Bill opened the doors of higher education to millions of working-class men and women. By 1947, veterans accounted for 49% of all college admissions. The universities of America were transformed, expanding rapidly to accommodate this influx of new students. These veterans were older, more mature, and more motivated than traditional students. They changed the culture of higher education. The home loan provision had an equally profound effect. It fueled the post-war housing boom and the growth of the suburbs. Millions of families were able to buy their first home, a cornerstone of the American dream. This created a massive new middle class. It changed the physical landscape of the country, with new communities like Levittown springing up on the outskirts of cities. The GI Bill is widely credited as a major driver of the post-war economic prosperity. As historian Edward Humes argues in his book Over Here, it was a massive investment in human capital. The government bet that, by educating its returning soldiers, it would create a more skilled and productive workforce. That bet paid off spectacularly. The country reaped the benefits for decades in the form of increased innovation, economic growth, and tax revenue. However, the picture is not perfect. The benefits of the GI Bill were not distributed equally. Due to segregation and discriminatory practices, particularly in the South, many African American veterans were unable to take full advantage of the bill. Many colleges would not admit them, and banks would often deny them home loans in the new suburban developments. This historic inequality, detailed in works like Ira Katznelson's When Affirmative Action Was White, meant that the GI Bill helped to widen the racial wealth gap even as it was building the white middle class. What would America look like today if the GI Bill had never been passed? How did the experience of war shape the way these veterans approach their education and careers? And what would be the impact of a similar massive investment in education and opportunity for today's generation? Number 10, how does a country pay for a war? Picture a child pulling a little red wagon filled with scrap metal. A mother is carefully counting out ration stamps at a grocery store. An actor is on a stage, not performing a play, but encouraging a crowd to buy war bonds. This is a picture of a total national economic mobilization. The Second World War was astronomically expensive. For the United States, the direct cost is estimated to have been over $300 billion in 1940s dollars, a figure that is many trillions in today's money. So, how did the country pay for it? The answer is a combination of three main things: raising taxes, borrowing money, and controlling the economy. Taxes went up dramatically. The Revenue Act of 1942 was a landmark piece of legislation. Before the war, only about 4 million Americans paid federal income tax. The 1942 Act lowered the exemptions and raised the rates, meaning that by the end of the war, over 43 million Americans were paying. It was a radical transformation of the American tax system. The government also introduced a new method of collection: payroll withholding. For the first time, taxes were taken directly out of people's paychecks. This made the massive increase in taxation more manageable and ensured a steady flow of revenue to the government. But taxes only covered about 45% of the cost. The rest had to be borrowed. The government did this through the sale of war bonds. This was a massive public relations campaign. The War Finance Committee under Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. enlisted Hollywood stars, popular singers, and local community leaders to promote the bonds. Posters with slogans like "Back the Attack" were everywhere. There were 8 major war bond drives. It was framed as a patriotic duty. Buying a bond was a way for every citizen, even a child with a few cents saved up, to directly contribute to the war effort. The campaign was a huge success, raising over $185 billion. The third piece was controlling the economy to prevent inflation. With factories running 24/7 and millions of people earning steady paychecks, there was a lot of money in the economy. But with so many goods being diverted to the war effort, there was a shortage of things to buy. This is a classic recipe for runaway inflation. The Office of Price Administration (OPA) was created to combat this. It set price ceilings on a wide range of goods and implemented the rationing system for scarce items. While unpopular, these controls were largely effective at keeping inflation in check during the war. This picture of economic mobilization is a picture of shared sacrifice. People paid higher taxes, they lent their savings to the government, and they accepted limits on what they could buy. There was a sense that everyone had to do their part. It was a level of government intervention in the economy that was unprecedented in American history, and it created the economic framework that fueled the post-war boom. What are the long-term consequences of a nation taking on such a massive amount of debt? How did this experience of collective economic action shape the generation's attitudes toward government and taxes? And could our deeply divided country ever agree to such a system of shared economic sacrifice again? Number 9. What did a secret look like? Picture a small town in the middle of the Tennessee wilderness. It wasn't on any map, it didn't officially exist. But inside its fences, tens of thousands of people lived and worked in massive windowless buildings, operating complex machinery they didn't understand. This was Oak Ridge, one of the secret cities of the Manhattan Project. This is a picture of the biggest secret of the war. The race to build the atomic bomb was a scientific and industrial undertaking of staggering scale and secrecy. The Manhattan Project, initiated in 1942 under the direction of General Leslie Groves and the scientific leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer, was the code name for this effort. It involved over 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion, about $28 billion in today's money, and almost none of the people involved knew the ultimate purpose of their work. 3 main secret cities were built from scratch. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was built to enrich uranium. And Hanford, Washington, was built to produce plutonium. And Los Alamos, New Mexico, was the remote laboratory high on a mesa where the scientists and engineers designed and built the bomb itself. These were complete, self-contained communities with houses, schools, and shops, all surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Workers were recruited from all over the country, told only that they were needed for an important war job. Secrecy was absolute. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here, was the motto. The scientific challenge was immense. The project brought together some of the greatest minds in the world, many of them refugees from the regimes in Europe. They were working on theoretical physics that was at the very edge of human knowledge. They had to solve thousands of engineering problems to turn a laboratory theory into a functional weapon. The work at Oak Ridge and Hanford involved building industrial facilities on a scale never before seen to separate isotopes of uranium or to create a new element, plutonium. The picture of a place like Oak Ridge is a picture of a different kind of war front. It was a war fought by physicists, chemists, and engineers. It was a war of slide rules and centrifuges. The people who worked there were part of the war effort, but their contribution was invisible. They lived in a strange, isolated world, working on a project of world-changing importance without knowing what it was. The story of the project, as chronicled in books like Richard Rhodes's Pulitzer Prize-winning The Making of the Atomic Bomb, is a dramatic tale of scientific genius, political intrigue, and profound moral questions. The successful test of the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, changed the world forever. It ushered in the atomic age and a new kind of terror. For the people of the secret cities, the news of the bombs being used on Japan was the first time most of them understood what they had been working on. What is it like to dedicate years of your life to a project whose purpose is a complete mystery to you? How did the leaders of the Manhattan Project manage the moral weight of what they were creating? And what are the long-term societal consequences of a government being able to operate on such a massive scale in total secrecy? Number 8, how do you heal a broken mind? I'd picture a hospital ward. It's quiet. The men in the beds are not missing limbs or covered in bandages. Their wounds are invisible. They stare at the ceiling, or they tremble uncontrollably, or they are lost in a world of their own. This is a picture of the psychological cost of war. They called it shell shock in the First World War. In the Second, it was often called combat fatigue, battle exhaustion, or neuropsychiatric breakdown. Today, we use the term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Whatever the label, the reality was the same: the human mind has a breaking point. The constant exposure to death, the fear, the exhaustion, and the moral stress of combat could shatter a person's psyche. The military was slow to understand this. At the beginning of the war, the official attitude was often that such breakdowns were a sign of weakness or cowardice. But the numbers became impossible to ignore. Psychiatric casualties were a major cause of troop loss. According to medical statistics from the era, in some theaters of the war, as many as 1 in 3 medical evacuations from the front lines were for psychiatric reasons. The Army realized it had a crisis on its hands. A new approach was needed. Psychiatrists and doctors in the field, like Thomas Salmon and William Menninger, pioneered the principles of forward psychiatry. The idea was to treat soldiers as close to the front line and as quickly as possible. They established a system of triage. Men showing signs of breakdown would be sent to a clearing station just behind the lines. Here they would be given a chance to rest, get a hot meal, sleep, and talk about their experiences. The goal was to treat the condition as a temporary exhaustion, not a permanent mental illness. The key principles were immediacy, proximity, and expectancy, the expectation that the soldier would recover and return to his unit. This approach was surprisingly effective for many, but for some, the wounds were too deep. They were sent to hospitals further back, in Europe or in the United States. Here they might receive therapy, sedation, or other treatments that were common at the time. The filmmaker John Huston made a documentary for the War Department in 1946 called Let There Be Light. It was filmed in a military psychiatric hospital and showed, with remarkable frankness, the struggles of veterans with deep psychological trauma. The film was so powerful and disturbing that the military suppressed it, and it was not publicly shown until 1980. The picture of this ward is a picture of the hidden cost of the good war. We celebrate the victories and the heroism, but we often forget the immense psychological suffering. Millions of veterans came home with these invisible wounds. They struggled with nightmares, depression, anxiety, and alcoholism for the rest of their lives. They often didn't talk about it. It was a generation that was taught to be tough and to keep their problems to themselves. How many families were quietly torn apart by the untreated trauma of a returning veteran? What did we learn from the psychiatric crisis of that war that informs how we treat veterans today? And what do we still not understand about the long-term effects of combat on the human brain? Number 7. What does a liberated city look like? Picture a street in Paris. It's filled with people. They are laughing, crying, and cheering. They are throwing flowers at a column of tanks and jeeps rolling by. A woman is kissing a soldier. A man is waving a French flag from a window. This is a picture of pure, unadulterated joy. This is the look of liberation. For the people of occupied Europe, the arrival of the Allied armies was the end of a long nightmare. They had lived for years under a brutal military occupation. They had faced food shortages, curfews, censorship, and the constant fear of arrest, deportation, or execution. The liberation of cities like Paris in August 1944 or Rome in June 1944 were moments of explosive celebration. The experience of the American soldiers was often surreal. One day they were fighting for their lives in the hedgerows of Normandy, and the next they were being mobbed by grateful civilians, handed bottles of wine, and treated as conquering heroes. Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent, captured these scenes in his columns. He described the crazy, delirious, shouting, weeping, dancing, kissing, flag-waving, arm-waving, wild and wonderful reception the troops received. It was a powerful reminder of what they were fighting for. It wasn't an abstract concept of freedom, it was the tangible joy on the faces of these people. But the picture of liberation is also more complex. It was not always a happy scene. Often the process of liberating a city involved destroying it. The fighting for towns in the Hürtgen Forest or during the Battle of the Bulge left them as rubble. The civilians who survived had lost everything. And liberation brought its own set of problems. There was the issue of fraternization. The Army High Command officially forbade soldiers from having personal relationships with civilians in enemy territory, a rule that was widely ignored. And liberation could also be ugly. In many towns, there were acts of retribution against those who had collaborated with the occupiers. These women who were accused of having relationships with enemy soldiers were often publicly humiliated, their heads shaved. This Operation Sauvage, or Wild Purge, was a difficult and violent chapter in the story of liberation. Most profoundly, as Allied soldiers moved deeper into Europe, They began to uncover the true horror of the regime they were fighting. They liberated not just cities, but also concentration camps and death camps. The things they saw in these places, the piles of bodies, the emaciated survivors were beyond anything they could have imagined. This experience, documented by journalists like Edward R. Murrow in his famous radio broadcast from Buchenwald, changed them forever. It stripped away any remaining romanticism about the war and replaced it with a grim understanding of the absolute evil they had been fighting. So the picture of a liberated city is a picture of human emotion at its extremes. It is a picture of joy and relief, but also of destruction, revenge, and the horrifying discovery of an industrial-scale program of human extermination. How does a society rebuild itself? Not just physically, but morally, after years of occupation and collaboration. What was the long-term psychological impact on the soldiers who were the first to witness the evidence of the death camps? And what does the joy of liberation tell us about the fundamental human need for freedom? Number 6, who was left behind? Picture a Japanese-American family. They are standing by a train, holding suitcases. They are not criminals. They are not prisoners of war. They are American citizens, and they are being sent to an internment camp. This is a picture of one of the greatest injustices in American history, carried out in the name of national security. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, fear and racism against Japanese Americans reached a fever pitch. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the military to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. It was used to force approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, over two-thirds of whom were American citizens, from their homes on the West Coast. They were given just days to sell their property, their businesses, and their homes, often at a massive loss. They were herded into temporary assembly centers at racetracks and fairgrounds, and then shipped to 10 remote, desolate relocation centers in the interior of the country. These camps, like Manzanar in California or Heart Mountain in Wyoming, were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. And families lived in hastily constructed barracks with no privacy. The government claimed this was a military necessity to prevent espionage and sabotage. But there was never a single documented case of a Japanese American committing such an act. The decision was driven by, as a later congressional commission concluded, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The Supreme Court, in its infamous 1944 decision in Korematsu v. United States, upheld the legality of the exclusion order, a decision that is now widely condemned as a major civil rights failure. The life in the camps was a struggle to maintain dignity and community in the face of injustice. The internees organized schools, newspapers, and sports leagues. They farmed the arid land. They tried to create a semblance of normal life, but they were prisoners in their own country. The psychological toll was immense. The experience is powerfully captured in memoirs like Jana Wakatsuki Houston's Farewell to Manzanar. The ultimate irony is that while their families were imprisoned, thousands of young Japanese American men were serving in the U.S. military. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, fighting in Europe, became the most decorated unit of its size in American history. They fought and died for a country that had locked up their parents. This picture of a family waiting for the train to the camps is a picture of the failure of American democracy. It is a reminder that even in a good war, fought for noble ideals, a nation can betray its own principles. It's a story of a community that was left behind, their rights and their loyalty questioned simply because of their ancestry. It took decades for the country to officially acknowledge this injustice. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which issued a formal apology and provided reparations to the surviving internees. What happens to a person's faith in their country when it unjustly imprisons them? How could the same nation that was fighting for freedom abroad engage in such a massive violation of civil liberties at home? And what are the warning signs we should look for to prevent such a thing from ever happening again? Number 5, how do you fight an ideology? Picture a classroom, but it's not in a school. It's on a military base. A group of soldiers are sitting on benches listening to a lecture. On a screen is a film, part of a series called Why We Fight. This is a picture of a nation trying to explain to its own soldiers the meaning of the war. The United States entered the war not because of a direct ideological threat, but because it was attacked. For many of the 16 million men and women who served, the reasons for fighting were initially very personal: to defend their country, to get back at the enemy for Pearl Harbor. But the government and the military leadership knew that this wasn't enough. To sustain a global war effort over several years, the soldiers and the public needed to understand the deeper principles at stake. The Why We Fight series was a key part of this effort. It was a series of 7 documentary films produced by the U.S. Army and directed by the acclaimed Hollywood director Frank Capra. Capra was tasked by Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall to create films that would explain to soldiers why they were being sent to fight and die in faraway lands. The films used a powerful combination of animation, newsreel footage, and captured enemy propaganda films to explain the history of the Axis powers' aggression. They framed the war as a struggle between a free world and a slave world. This was a massive effort in mass communication and persuasion. It was, in effect, propaganda, but it was propaganda in service of a democratic cause. The films were shown to millions of American troops. They were also released to the public and were seen by millions of civilians. They helped to build and sustain a national consensus for the war. They explained that this was not just a war between nations, but a war between two opposing ideas about how human beings should live. The effort to explain the war went beyond films. The military established information and education programs. They published newspapers for the troops, like Stars and Stripes. They brought in speakers and held discussions. The goal was to create what was called a thinking soldier, a citizen soldier who understood the political and moral dimensions of the conflict. This picture of a classroom on a military base is a picture of the battle for hearts and minds. It shows that the greatest generation was not just asked to fight, but also to understand. They were participants in a great ideological struggle. They were fighting against regimes built on militarism, racial supremacy, and the complete subjugation of the individual to the state. And they were fighting for the ideals, however imperfectly practiced, of democracy, individual liberty, and human dignity. How effective was this ideological training? Did the average soldier really care about the difference between a free world and a slave world, or was he just trying to survive? And in an age of misinformation and deep political division, could our country ever again unite around a shared understanding of why we might need to fight? Number 4, what did a homecoming look like? You picture a dock in San Francisco or New York. A huge transport ship is pulling in, its decks and railings crowded with soldiers. On the pier, a massive crowd is waving, cheering, and crying. A military band is playing. This is a picture of the end of the journey. This is homecoming. For the millions of servicemen and women overseas, the thought of this moment was what kept them going. The dream of returning home, of seeing family, of sleeping in their own bed was a powerful motivator. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, and then in the Pacific in August 1945, the largest demobilization in history began. It was called Operation Magic Carpet. The logistical challenge was immense. The military had to bring home over 8 million troops from all over the globe. They used every available ship, naval warships, converted cargo ships, and even captured enemy vessels. The conditions were often crowded, but no one cared. They were going home. The long sea voyages were a time of transition, a period of decompression between the war zone and civilian life. The scenes at the docks were ones of overwhelming emotion. Wives were reunited with husbands they hadn't seen in years. Fathers met children who had been born while they were away. Parents hugged sons they had feared they would never see again. It was a moment of national celebration and profound personal relief. The iconic photograph by Alfred Eisenstadt of a sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square on VJ Day captures this explosion of joy and relief perfectly. But the homecoming was not always simple. The soldiers had been changed by their experiences. They had seen things that their families could never understand. The world they had been fighting for had also changed. The women had gone to work. The economy was different. The soldiers had to find their place in this new post-war world. Many veterans struggled to adjust. They had been living a life of intense discipline and camaraderie, where the stakes were life and death. Civilian life could seem boring and pointless in comparison. The readjustment was a difficult process for many. The GI Bill helped enormously by providing a path forward through education and homeownership. But the internal adjustments were harder. This is the story told in the classic 1946 film, The Best Years of Our Lives, which portrays the difficult homecomings of 3 different veterans. So the picture of the homecoming is a picture of joy, but also of a new beginning filled with uncertainty. It was the end of the war, but it was the start of a new, personal struggle for millions of veterans, the struggle to build a life in the peace they had fought so hard to win. How did the shared experience of the war bond a generation together, even after they went their separate ways? What were the conversations like between husbands and wives, fathers and sons, as they tried to bridge the gap of experience that separated them? And how much of the can-do spirit of the post-war boom was simply a generation trying to build a normal, quiet life after years of chaos? Well, number three, how do you mourn a million people? Picture a woman. She is in her home. She is holding a telegram. Her face is a mask of grief. On her window, there is a small banner with a gold star on it. This is a picture of the ultimate cost of the war. The Gold Star tradition began in World War I. A family with a service member would display a blue star banner in their window. If that service member was killed, the blue star was replaced with a gold one. During the Second World War, these Gold Star banners became a common, heartbreaking sight in communities all across America. Each one represented a life cut short, a family shattered. The United States suffered over 400,000 military deaths in the war. It's a number that is hard to comprehend. It's the entire population of a city like Cleveland or New Orleans gone. And for each of those deaths, there was a ripple effect of grief that spread through a family and a community. The primary way that families received this devastating news was through a telegram from the War Department. It usually began with the cold, formal words, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son." The arrival of a Western Union boy on a bicycle became a moment of terror in every neighborhood. The grief was private, but it was also a shared public experience. The entire country was in mourning. But there was a resolve to it. The loss was seen as a necessary sacrifice for a greater cause. This idea was central to the culture of the time. In films, in newspapers, and in speeches, the dead were honored as heroes who had given their last full measure of devotion. But this public narrative could not erase the private pain. For a mother, a father, a wife, or a child, the loss was not a statistic. It was a specific, irreplaceable person. They were left with letters, photographs, and memories. Many of the dead were buried in temporary military cemeteries overseas. After the war, families were given the choice to have the remains of their loved ones repatriated to the United States or to have them buried in one of the permanent American military cemeteries established abroad, like the one in Normandy. It was an agonizing decision. This picture of a Gold Star mother is a picture of the true price of victory. It is a reminder that the greatest generation is not just defined by its triumphs, but also by its suffering. Their greatness lies not just in their willingness to fight, but in their ability to endure such staggering loss and still build a future. The legacy of that loss is still with us. It's in the quiet cemeteries, both here and overseas. It's in the names on the war memorials in 1,000 small towns. It's a debt that can never be fully repaid. How does a society collectively process such a massive scale of death? What happens to the grief of a nation when a war is over? And how do we properly remember and honor not just the sacrifice of the soldiers, but the lifelong sacrifice of the families they left behind? Number two, what is the opposite of a weapon? Picture a man in a doctor's office. He is rolling up his sleeve. A nurse is preparing to give him a shot of a new wonder drug. The drug is penicillin. This is a picture of a different kind of wartime miracle. While the Manhattan Project was secretly developing a weapon of mass destruction, another massive scientific and industrial effort was underway to mass produce a weapon of mass healing. The discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in 1928 was a scientific breakthrough, but it remained a laboratory curiosity. It was incredibly difficult to produce in large quantities. When the war began, military leaders knew that infections were a major killer. In previous wars, more soldiers died from diseases and infected wounds than from actual combat. The Allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain, launched a crash program to solve the problem of penicillin production. It was a race as urgent as the one to build the bomb. The effort was led by scientists like Howard Florey and Ernst Chain at Oxford University, who first demonstrated penicillin's effectiveness. The American government, through the War Production Board, coordinated the efforts of major pharmaceutical companies, research universities, and government labs. It was a huge public-private partnership. They had to figure out everything from scratch, how to find better strains of the penicillium. Mold, a particularly productive one, was famously found on a cantaloupe in a market in Peoria, Illinois, how to grow it in huge, deep fermentation tanks, and how to purify it. By 1943, they had cracked the code. Production exploded. In the first half of 1943, only 400 million units of penicillin were available. By the time of the D-Day invasion in June 1944, American companies were producing over 100 billion units a month, enough to treat every single Allied soldier wounded in the invasion. The impact on the battlefield was revolutionary. Soldiers who would have died from infections like gas gangrene or pneumonia were now saved. Complex surgeries could be performed without the same fear of post-operative infection. The death rate from disease in the U.S. Army was a fraction of what it had been in World War I. Penicillin and the sulfa drugs that preceded it changed the calculus of military medicine. This picture of a simple injection is a picture of the quiet, life-saving side of the war effort. It was a triumph of science, engineering, and cooperation. And unlike the atomic bomb, its legacy was purely life-affirming. After the war, penicillin became available to the civilian population, where it saved countless more lives and launched the age of antibiotics. It was one of the greatest medical advances in human history, and it was accelerated into existence by the pressures of the war. How many of the greatest generation who survived the war only did so because of this new drug? What other scientific and medical breakthroughs were born from the necessities of the war? And what does the story of penicillin's development tell us about what is possible when government, industry, and science unite to solve a single, urgent problem? Number one, what does it mean to choose? Picture a young man standing in front of a recruitment poster. The poster shows a determined Uncle Sam pointing directly at the viewer with the words, "I want you for U.S. Army." The young man's face is resolved. He is about to make a choice that will define his life and the course of history. For the greatest generation, the war was the central, defining event of their lives, but it began with a choice. For many, after Pearl Harbor, it was the choice to enlist. Millions volunteered in the days and weeks after the attack. They left their jobs, their farms, their schools. They stood in long lines at recruiting offices across the country. They felt a sense of duty, of patriotism, of a need to respond to an attack on their nation. For millions of others, the choice was made for them. The selective service system, the draft, had been in place since 1940, but after the U.S. entered the war, it expanded dramatically. Over 10 million men were drafted. For them, the choice was not whether to serve, but how. But the idea of choice goes deeper than just enlistment. This generation as a whole made a collective choice. They chose to accept the immense sacrifices that the war demanded. They chose to pay higher taxes, to accept rationing, to work long hours in factories. They chose to put the needs of the nation and the world ahead of their own personal comfort and safety. As a society, they chose to confront a global threat rather than ignore it. This was not an easy choice. The country was deeply isolationist before the war. Many Americans did not want to get involved in another European conflict. The America First Committee, with prominent members like Charles Lindbergh, argued forcefully against intervention. The choice to become the arsenal of democracy and ultimately to enter the war was a deliberate, contested, and profound one. This final picture of a single individual making a decision is the foundational image of the entire story. The grand strategies, the massive industrial production, the epic battles, it all comes down to this. It starts with a person who chose to sign up, a person who chose to do their duty when drafted, a person who chose to go to work in a shipyard, a person who chose to buy a war bond. The greatest generation was not born great. They were ordinary people who, when faced with an extraordinary crisis, made a collective choice to do whatever was necessary to win. Their greatness was earned, one difficult choice at a time. Their legacy is not just the victory they won, but the example they set. They showed what a democratic society is capable of when it is united in a common purpose. They came out of the Great Depression, a time of national despair, and saved the world. Then they came home and built the most prosperous nation in history. They made a choice to believe in the future. What was the exact moment, in the mind of like a young farmer or a city kid when the abstract idea of duty became a concrete personal decision? If faced with a similar existential threat today, would our society be capable of making the same collective choice to sacrifice for the common good? And what is the choice that history is asking our generation to make right now?